We've talked about Volkswagen, Peugeot, Lamborghini, Citroën, and now I'm turning my attention to Audi. Audi has a ton of super popular, very successful performance cars and just production vehicles alike through the years. The Quattro, the R8, the Le Mans dominating monsters, the list goes on. But this series is to shine the spotlight on the vehicles which maybe you haven't heard of. And for many more casual fans, the majority of these you probably won't have seen before. And of course, as always, if you would like to drop some which you think I might have forgotten or should have included on the list, that's what the comments are for, and without any further ado, let's jump straight into it. First up, speaking of unsung heroes, this one will be familiar if you are a fan of that series here on the channel, the Audi Avus Quattro. Back in 1991, they were already getting their fingers into the W12 pie. The Avus Quattro could have been a genuine contender on the supercar scene with the likes of the Porsche 959, the Bugatti EB110 and beyond. It never had a functional engine though, it was just a wooden engine in a show car, but it would have been doubtless very quick. All aluminium construction, as you can tell, Quattro four-wheel drive, 1250 kilos with, as mentioned, that proposed 6-litre W12, probably around 500 or so horsepower. Of course, it didn't reach production, but you can see some cues in there which were carried over. Of course, the W12 engine lineage. Audi's fascination with aluminium production cars didn't go away, because even vehicles like the A2 reached production with that kind of manufacturing. The next one is a vehicle which I occasionally reference on the channel, and it's certainly not one of the prettiest ones here, but it actually had more of a direct correlation to later vehicles than the Avus did. The Rosemeyer, named of course after Bernd Rosemeyer, an Audi driver who famously died driving the legendary Streamliner back in the Auto Union days. This one actually has ties to the Veyron, as pretty much all Volkswagen Group concept cars seem to have back in the 90s and early 2000s. This one though, much more directly, because it's an 8-litre W16 with four-wheel drive. Much like Bentley's Nordier, another one of my favourite forgotten concepts, is naturally aspirated, so no quad turbo like the Veyron had. That means 700 horsepower instead of 1000. Also a very curious change, a 6-speed manual gearbox. And speaking to the costs of the Veyron, Audi partially decided not to do it because of how much it was going to cost. The next one is a vehicle which is much more grounded, definitely still in the exotic car world, and I really do think it's a shame that this one never reached production. In fact, I'm not the only one, because back around the 1990s, 1991 in fact, alongside the Avus, a concept car by the name of the Audi Quattro Spyder was built. And not only is this a far prettier vehicle than either of the concepts which we've talked about so far, but this could have quite legitimately been Germany's answer to something like a Lotus Esprit. It had quite believable styling. It looks like the kind of thing which could have gone on the market without being obscenely expensive or ridiculous to engineer, and it even had a 180 horsepower, which sounds low by today's standards, but it's fine for its time, 2.8 litre V6, mid-engine layout of course, and only weighed 1100 kilos. Not all of the vehicles on this list are concept cars, but the next one does continue down that route with a vehicle called the Steppenwolf. This is a vehicle which is cool not so much because of its performance, although it wasn't slow thanks to having a 3.2 V6 engine, but this one kind of influenced production in other ways. It was originally shown at the Paris Motor Show, and of course is based on a similar platform to the TT Quattro and the Audi A3. Of course it had four-wheel drive, or Quattro again, and you can definitely see some of these styling, well, cues, if you will, in the later Audi Q3, etc. It even had air ride, which was very similar to what ended up being in the all-road Quattro. Like I said, it's not a vehicle which will necessarily wow you in its own right, but it is cool to at least see certain things from these concept cars watering their way down into actual production vehicles, and that is an idea which we're going to come back to later on. This next vehicle is of course a hero of the thumbnail, and it's a funny one because thanks to Ken Block, way more people know about this car than used to. In fact, this would have probably been, until relatively recent years, the poster child for the most unsung of Audis. It is of course the RS002. The original idea came from Roland Gumpert, who of course worked with Audi in terms of their rally program in particular, and the Quattro was already a fantastic force to be reckoned with. And although he proposed having a mid-engine Quattro to kind of deal with some of the inherent understeer and handling issues which the Quattro did still have, Audi didn't want to do that, or in particular Dr. Piche didn't seem to want that to happen. Gumpert decided to go behind the scenes and make a little secret project. It did not initially look like the 002, it looked more like a conventional Quattro but kind of chopped around. Walter Roll actually drove it and absolutely loved the car, but then Ferdinand found out about it and unfortunately personally oversaw the car being destroyed. It later on turned around because they developed a second car. This one was more powerful, even lighter, even quicker, and is this vehicle, up to 690 horsepower, barely 1000 kilos, so up around 700 horsepower per ton, apparently a top speed in the region of 186 miles an hour, and it was fairly obviously intended for the evolution of Group B, if you will, the Group S rally, which itself went away around 1986 for many unfortunate reasons that many of us know. The next one one is possibly my favourite from this entire list because of what it represents. Of course, Audi themselves did make the R8 V12 TDI concept, which I really think sucks that they didn't produce that, because what an awesome idea. This one though takes it way beyond the R8, because this could have been a Le Mans hypercar level diesel supercar, very obviously inspired by the then recent R18 e-tron. Also some of the aero is directly inspired by Audi's DTM program as well. This one was basically only a design study around 2013. Audi themselves apparently was surprised that it still existed, and now it is on display. It would have been an absolute monster on the street, and it's funny because it almost seems like Audi had a clue of things to come, albeit unintentionally, because back in 2013 this still could pass as a modern Le Mans hypercar, and the idea of a road-going version kind of ties into those as well to some degree. The next one is one of those concept cars which you would see in passing in a page or two of Top Gear magazine back in the day and kind of forget about it and never come back to it because there wasn't really any reason to, but personally I think it's a pretty cool car, and once again kind of lived on in spirit. It is the very pretty, in my opinion at least, Audi Shooting Brake. A bit of an uninspired name, it has to be said, but around 2005 this was an Audi TT based shooting brake, a 2+2 hot hatch if you will, that same iconic 3.2 VR6 engine, about 250 horsepower, of course 4-wheel drive, 6-second 0 to 60 time, speed limited to 155, so basically like a Golf R32 or an Audi TT Quattro but with the extra practicality. Unfortunately around 2007 they came out and said that this would never be produced, but as I'm sure some of you have had some inklings of in your mind, this kind of lived on in the form of the Scirocco, because even though it's not a direct correlation, you can see more than a fair similarity between the two ideas. The next couple of vehicles are intrinsically linked. Neither were built by Audi technically, but both of them very easily could have been because of the level of quality and thought put into them. The first one's from a company which we have discussed before in the form of Arts. We talked of course about the crazy super wide Golf from Arts back in the day, and this one is the Arts Quattro Combi. Now this one will be familiar if you've done any kind of deep dive Google searches for crazy looking cars, and particularly on the topic of shooting brakes if you are into that kind of thing, because back in the day a chap by the name of Gunther Arts loved the idea of taking essentially a sports car or a performance coupe and turning it into something which could also carry a washing machine in the back at the same time. He did it to a couple of different Porsches, and of course he also built a couple of Audi Quattro based cars, probably most notably a 4-door version of the Quattro based on the more lowly underpinnings but then brought up to the level of the Quattro, and this one which is the primary vehicle which we're focusing on here, the Quattro Combi, which is that stretched shooting brake version. Journalists at the time checked out the vehicle, interviewed him about it. They raised concerns potentially about the super long windows. It looks kind of like the body rigidity might be compromised from the extra length. Apparently it was made properly. It had chassis strengthening, the roof section was done very well, the rear window was kind of Scirocco based but quite expensive apparently to do, and it's a really cool looking end product which, as I said, kind of looks like Audi themselves could have made it. Speaking of something which Audi could have made, this one would be a lot less likely given the Quattro's kind of purpose, but well, if you can think of it, somebody's probably done it, and that is another company by the name of Treser. Instead of Gunther Arts, this time it's Walter Treser, who decided to make, among other things, a convertible Quattro, which definitely won't be for everyone visually speaking, but this one really gives me Nissan Silvia Verietta vibes, especially with the roof up. Of course, it's not just a visual exercise. They would give you upgraded interiors with better quality leather, sound systems. It even had performance upgrades as well, so it genuinely was quicker with 250 horsepower rather than the, what would it have been, about 200, 220-ish of the Quattro at the time, at least in normal wheelbase form. He did that by upgrading in particular the fuel delivery system from a Porsche 928. It was around $141,000 or the equivalent of that at the time, so not exactly an affordable machine, and with the looks, definitely not for everyone, but then went the extra mile in terms of actually not only making it work, but making it work in a way that looks like it kind of could have been made by the original manufacturer. The next one's a vehicle which will have all of the Super Saloon fans salivating, because it's a car that many of us have thought, why don't they do that, for many years? And on the surface level it makes sense why they wouldn't, because it's not really that kind of car. This is the RS8. Only one prototype in this kind of flat matte-esque sort of grey colour was ever built, based on a 3rd generation A8, or more so an S8, which of course is the quick version that you can actually get. The S8 was already a 4-litre V8, of course turbo aspirated, about 513 horsepower, so not exactly lacking anyway, and it's proposed that there could be one primary reason why this wasn't produced, and that was that the RS7 was coming out at a similar time. That, of course, being a 553 horsepower car, this would have probably been reasonably in that same kind of region, you could assume. I personally propose a second reason on top of that. Not only did they not want to step on the toes of the RS7 in terms of sales, but I also think that the A8, being its kind of Mercedes S-Class or BMW BMW 7 Series equivalent, I just don't think they would have considered the market to be ripe enough to want a car like this. Sure, us petrol heads would, but in terms of actual sales, well, how many businessmen do you think are actually going to go for an RS8? An S8? Maybe, but even then, most of them don't need that kind of performance. They just go for like a big effortless diesel. Either way though, super badass car. The next one's a fantastic looking design study in my opinion, a really genuinely cool little car from way back in the 70s. Around 1973, there was a team up between kind of three areas of expertise. There was Audi themselves, in terms of not really building the car, but the parts that it's based on, in particular an Audi 80, which was shortened and lighter. Then of course we've got Karmann and Italdesign as well, and this was called the Ace of Spades. It's not a vehicle which is going to melt your face in terms of performance, around a 1.3, 1.5 litre kind of territory, straight 4 in of course the Audi 80 of the time, but 4-speed manual, as I said, shorter and lighter, so it would have at least been quicker than the Audi 80. And I just think it's a really cool looking car, a radical design. You don't often see Germany and Italy teaming up in terms of design, at least not as often as you would think. And it's also inspired, and this I think becomes very clear when you know this, by vehicles like the Lancia Delta. You can definitely see that sort of inspiration in there, and yeah, such a shame that something like this was never actually produced. I mentioned earlier on as well that we would return to the idea of concepts which do have seeds which ended up in production, and this is one of the kings of that. In fact, you might be able to say that at least from the concepts which we've talked about in this video, this might be the single most influential one across multiple Audi models, and it's called the Audi Avantissimo from around the turn of the millennium. This immediately evokes A8, RS6, all-road, so many Audis which came after, and it's actually quite surprising when you look at stuff like its interior, how even over a decade later, you could still see those same design cues. Even in terms of its performance, it was a 420 horsepower, 4.2 litre V8. That should sound familiar because it's exactly the same kind of thing that the RS6 of the time had. Again, its air ride suspension, much like the Steppenwolf earlier on, did have that trickle-down effect into production vehicles, so it wasn't lost, at least. This vehicle didn't reach production, but it also kind of did. A partsed-out version of it in multiple different cars. Kind of the granddaddy of many modern Audis. Much like the Audi Avus, the next one will be more than familiar for Unsung Heroes fans. It's one of my favourite aftermarket tuned Audis, based on the already very, very good TT platform. It is of course the MTM Bimoto TT, a monstrous version of the Audi TT Quattro with two engines, one in the front, one in the back, brought up to, well, initially they were hoping for 500 horsepower each. It actually ends up seeming like around the 880 to 900 horsepower region, so not exactly lacking in comparison, and this is at least based on testing a 232 mile an hour car, and the craziest part is it can go from 0 to 190 miles an hour in 23 seconds. For reference, the first generation Veyron did 0 to 200 in 24. That's pretty damn close. And to round off our list, we've got a pair of very, very cool speed record cars. We've talked about a couple of speed record vehicles in past episodes, most recently of course for Citroën, and these are no less badass. The first one you could say is even more badass because it was built by a chap called Jeff Gurner, who at the time was nearly 60 years old when he was developing the vehicle. He'd been tuning these and developing them for years, and I really would urge you to do a Google search if you'd like to know more about this one and look into Quattro World. It's a great little interview that he did with them talking about the vehicle. It's based on a vehicle which he kind of just liked, and that's why he decided to go with it. It's a good platform, great for tuning. He'd already turned his daily driver version into a 160 mile an hour car, and it is of course the UR shape Audi S4. It was tuned up to the point of being a 9,000 RPM, still turbo 5-pot, that legendary engine, and of course with 962 horsepower at the wheels, was an absolute monster in a straight line, and that was the whole point. This vehicle reached 242 miles an hour, and apparently he had some pretty leery opposite lock on it where it almost tried to spin out even with the parachute deployed. Unfortunately, on another run which it did shortly after, the engine blew, but still an amazing result of hitting 242 miles an hour in an Audi S4. And as I said, we are rounding off with another speed record car, a much older one but a similar kind of shape, and this one was built and fielded not by a fan but by Audi themselves. In fact, they built a couple of these for the express purpose of beating a Mercedes record set with the C111 concept, and of course they set that record at Nardo, which is where Audi took theirs as well. The vehicle they chose here was the Audi 200 turbo platform, and it was named the Nardo 6000. The only remaining one of the three was actually sold not too long ago for 235,000 euros from a Dr. C.G. Brunn. Apologies, I forgot the pronunciation wrong, but he, and this is pretty awesome, was one of those original drivers. Out of the three vehicles, only one of them had a special 25 valve engine setup, and that is the car which survived. They broke two records with it at the time back in the 80s. I believe it was 1988 or so if I recall correctly. correctly, and that 2.2 litre straight 5 engine was tuned up to around 650 horsepower, and it hit a speed of 350 kilometers an hour in testing, and then broke two records: 500 kilometers traveled at an average of 325 kilometers an hour, and then 1,000 kilometers traveled at an average of 326 kilometers an hour. So tremendous performance. Unfortunately, at least one of those vehicles crashed, and like I said, only one remains, but what a super badass car. So basically starting the list with some cool concept cars and ending it with some, you could say, even cooler production-based super saloons to break amazing records. If of course you've heard of some of these before, I wouldn't be surprised given our fandoms here on the channel, but for most fans, there's probably at least one or two here which are new to you. Like I said, if you think there's a major one which I've forgotten or overlooked, absolutely drop it in the comments, and now that we've reached episode 5, I'm putting them all in their own playlist. So if you would like to binge watch the whole series, you can click the link down below in the description, and of course, I'll see you there. But for now, thanks for watching.